Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa.
One of the topics that we find complicated to cover on this podcast and in our work in general is the topic of nutrition and diet and exercise, because while we know how important it is, a well-balanced diet, enough physical activity for kids and every living being on this planet, we also know that those topics carry a lot of baggage for people. They're complicated, that sometimes even saying the wrong thing once about what someone's eaten or what they've done with their body can stick with someone for the rest of their life and could even affect their behaviors and choices down the road. And so we've been, frankly, really, really cautious. I mean, we're already fairly cautious, but extraordinarily cautious as we think about how we cover it here. And that's why this episode with Maya Feller is so wonderful and important to us, because she approaches these weighty topics. Yes, there are 4 million puns in this episode, including just now, with real sensitivity and thoughtfulness.
Yeah. I mean, look, like everything else that we cover, there's the information and then there's the how to talk about it. And when it comes to nutrition, just the word diet, the noun is information and the verb is how to talk about it, right? Because the verb version of diet connotes something that is so heavy and laden in our culture, whereas the noun is really all the things that you put into your body to fuel you. It can be, I think we skew positive when we're talking about it as the things we eat, and we tend to feel overwhelmed by it or skew negative when we talk about how we are managing those choices. So it's complicated. It's complicated for adults. It's very complicated for people who are raising kids and they are desperate to not create issues around what you're feeding yourself and how you're feeding yourself. And then, of course, is the layer of access, affordability, right? So there's sort of the knowledge of all the things you should do. And then there's the what can you actually do? And Maya covers so much of this territory, talking about not just the information, but also the delivery of that information and how to empower, frankly, people of all ages, Vanessa, in making really wonderful choices. Hi, Maya.
Hi, Cara.
Are we in 7th grade? That felt like 7th grade.
It's on. Maya, I'm very excited. We are very excited to have you here. I was talking to a friend recently about this upcoming episode, and it was such an interesting conversation because she basically said, oh, so finally someone's going to talk about longevity and tweens and teens. It's like there's, right? Adults constantly think about longevity medicine and the longevity lens and how to stretch out life. And no one talks to tweens and teens about that. And I was like, well, partly because their prefrontal cortex is not developed and they don't think about longevity, but it's so true. Nutrition and diet and lifestyle in general, really, as we get older, we flip those words into one gigantic word, and that word is longevity. And so I think that would be a great place to start this conversation, is sort of thinking about how we as adults who have our own baggage and our own history with food and eating and the rituals of what we do and don't put into our body, how we can reframe that longer lens for not just for ourselves, but also for the kids in our lives.
I love that framing. And I have to, it makes me think of my kids who are always holding me to task. They'll remind me of things that I've said to them. And they're like, didn't you say? And I'm like, I did say, okay, let me reframe that. But what I love so much about thinking about teens and tweens and like our younger folks in that longevity lens is that we do this thing with nutrition and kind of kids and health in general, where we're like, you're a kid and it's separate from who you're going to be when you grow up.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're like, you're a kid. Here's the kids menu. You're not going to eat the things that we adults eat. Here's your kids menu. Or you're a kid. Here's your kids yoga class. That's for my daughter in particular, who's like, I don't want to go to a kids yoga class because they treat me like a baby. And so I think I remember in school thinking about pediatric nutrition, it was so separate from what happens when you turn 12, 13, and 14. And it's like we, want the research to back up making that link. And then we also, too, want adults and trusted adults and caregivers to understand that what happens when we're younger, especially from the food perspective, lays the groundwork actually for the next decade. So I'm super excited to dive into this.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have been very cautious covering diet and nutrition on this podcast because it's such a fraught topic. It's a fraught topic for many people individually. It's a fraught topic in our culture and our society. And Maya, you work and interact with all different cultures around the world and their relationship to food and nutrition. So I think it would really help our audience to hear where you're coming from and sort of what your story and your experiences and how that helps frame your approach to diet and nutrition. It's almost like hard to say the word diet even without it implying like going on a diet rather than
it's
like
diet the noun, not diet the verb.
Yes, but we are so acculturated that even just the very word diet doesn't think, oh, a balanced diet of fruits and vegetables and proteins and carbohydrates. It's like immediately we go to weight loss. And it's so, it's such a burdened term. And this episode is about unburdening that term and really pointing to the importance of helping kids understand about how what they put in their bodies affects them in the short term and the long term. So let's start, Maya, with you sharing your story and your perspective, and then we'll dive in.
Absolutely. So, Vanessa, I appreciate that. And I actually want to start by saying that in general, I actually refer to eating patterns simply because I can't figure out myself how to say diet in a way that isn't like socio-political, right? Like I can't unpack that. And like, so I just say eating pattern. And in my practice, Maya Feller Nutrition, so we're a group of dietitians and we work with people across the life cycle. And we're actually a diverse group of dietitians, predominantly Black women. And in and of itself, that's fairly unique because on the whole, dietitians are predominantly white and female, but white Anglo-American and female. And so I'm already coming from a niche kind of part of health as a minority within a minority. And because I have my own lived experience as a first generation Afro-Caribbean American woman, I definitely understand super deeply that how we eat, what we eat, our access to food is totally tied into our zip codes, our ability to access nutrition education, our ability to access health education, and then also our ability to access care for ourselves. So when I'm thinking about nutrition, I absolutely always recognize that what I'm saying may work for some, but not all, and that it still has to be further individualized. When I think and I step back and I think about data sets, because I love data sets, and I think about like the current recommendations and guidelines and benchmarks, I'm also really aware that they are really kind of, not, I shouldn't say really kind of, but they are based in Anglo-American, Anglo-European thought patterns. And it's interesting because I did sit on the best diets for US News and World Report, that selection committee. And for, many years in a row, the Mediterranean diet always comes up as the quote unquote best. And for many years, I have been saying that the Mediterranean has 22 nations around that sea. And we could talk about food from North Africa and from the Middle East. And they, from my perspective, when I look at what is a quote unquote balanced pattern of eating, contain the same things as the foods coming from France and Italy that border that same ocean. And so I bring that up because it really frames how I think about the interaction of food across the life cycle. And I'm a big expand and add rather than limit and take away.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important, Maya, that we also recognize this episode is being recorded in February of 2025. And so what you point to at the beginning of your comments about access to health information, access to care, frankly, access to food stamps that allow people to purchase their their nutrition, their food, all of those things, like that is in flux right now. And so statements and framing that we will offer in this conversation may change between now and when this episode gets released and may continue to change over the coming years.
Also, just to put a lighter touch on it, I mean, is there anything US News and World Report doesn't rank? I mean, come on now.
I know
my shrinking breasts. Does that?
Oh, I bet they rank that.
Yeah. So I think that's really important to. I just think to think about where our norms come from. I mean, I come from a family that are filled with Eastern European Jews back many, many generations, and my kids laugh about what counts as nutrition in our familial history. And basically there's not a vegetable in sight for 250 years.
There are pickled vegetables.
Right.
That's what I wanted to say. There's cabbage, there's potatoes, those root vegetables, they really count. They
really last through a winter of famine and pogroms.
Have a very important
they were
place.
Not eating prunes was a magical addition sometime
really
in the
was.
Last century.
I would love to read that book, The History of Prunes and the
History of Prunes. Yeah. I'm sure
as it relates to bone health.
I mean, so that's the thing. It's how have cultures, we all come from different cultures, many of whom have had times of scarcity and if we were lucky, times of abundance. And we're bringing all of that in. And when we think about generationally, how our families, how our parents and our grandparents and our extended families spoke about food, treated our relationships to food, it's very much informed by not just the actual food, but the experiences of migration, the experiences of trauma, frankly.
Agreed.
That, wrap around. And so as we dive into sort of the burdens and the baggage that we carry, we say this with no judgment of how people manage their relationship to food, because it's a really emotional topic and it's a very layered topic. I will joke about it. And also there's some really heavy stuff there. Sorry for the terrible pun. I want that overlay that we are not judging anybody for how they're dealing with it, either because of zip code or socioeconomic reality or cultural overlay or any of that. And Maya, what I love about your approach, and I'd love for you to share with people, is that you talk about how there's no definitive answer, right? There's no one right way. There's no one right approach. Can you share that with our listeners?
Absolutely. So I like to do this thing where I'm just because your neighbor did it doesn't mean that it's good for you. I actually said this in my house the other day. And I was like, just because it worked for you doesn't mean that we can generalize it to everyone else. And I do think in wellness, and I put that in quotes, that we see a lot of this is the only way, right? And in whatever type of specialty, like we're informed by data. And so we have an idea. I have an issue with many of our data sets, and I feel like they could actually be quite diverse or more diverse. But we're informed by data. And so, yes, we can follow the science. And at the same time, we have to listen to the individual. So from my perspective, let's say someone comes in and we've got someone like a kid, which we've had before, had extraordinarily high triglycerides. There are many ways to slice that apple and take a look at that child. Someone could say, oh, this kid is eating candy and only carbohydrates. That's why the triglycerides are through the roof, based on what we know from the scientific evidence. And so a provider could make that assumption even before seeing the child. And then the child could present as a Asian American child. The child could present as a Mexican American child. The child could present as a Black American child, and the child could present as a white American child. Depending on who the provider is, if they've done the unpacking of their own biases, the way that that child presents to them will now inform how they interpret that first idea that they had when they saw those labs and their treatment.
You mean their assumptions?
100%.
Because you know what happens when you make an assumption.
I mean, it can never be good. Like it can never be
good.
Right? And so when I am thinking about that individualization, I come in literally as a blank slate. And I say, okay, it is up to me to listen to you, to the family, to the child about your lived experience. Take that whole thing and value it the same way that I value whatever that laboratory data is, because it is just as important. And in many cases is that key that could be missing. And then we individualize. And then we do all the fun of literally cooking in the kitchen together to create that nutrition plan that is great for the person in this moment. And then we modify.
Right. So what you are saying is essentially that we have all these data points, and for those who aren't watching on YouTube and they're just listening, there's so many air quotes happening right now. And I just want to make sure to emphasize that because these air quotes are very important. There are so many data points. So there's the data point of what we assume a diet of a kid might be. There's the data point of what we assume a cultural diet may be. There's the data point of the labs that we may or may not have telling us where someone's cholesterol or triglyceride levels are. There's the data point of genetics. Does everyone in the family have high triglycerides? And is it something that the family, when they see those labs, they either freak out or they say, oh, well, everyone in my family has it, as if it is an insurmountable, right? So and then there are many, many more data points. And you're exactly right that then there's an intervention to be made. And then there's a reassessment. Because whenever you make an intervention, you got to pull back and reassess. And part of the reassessment is sort of understanding those biases that we all bring. Was I right or wrong about how this family with its cultural background was going to approach diet? And then there's the reassessment of what did the shift in diet actually do for this kid, lab-wise, energy level-wise, mood-wise, right? So and then do we need to keep shifting or not? And in the world of pediatrics, what can be so complicated sometimes is through our adult lens, through our longevity lens, we see a child go from having a very high BMI to an improved BMI, right? They might not lose weight. They might stop gaining weight and growing, but they are starting to look, quote unquote, here, big air quotes, healthier on a growth chart. Are they developing mental health issues around these habits? Are we introducing issues around their body image, around their sense of self connected to food, which Vanessa was alluding to in the beginning? So like, I think so many parents in particular they do bring their own baggage, and they're so worried that in the name of health and getting healthy, they are introducing new problems and new issues for their kids. And all of this gets snowballed, and it feels sometimes scary and insurmountable.
Usually when I work with families and kids, I actually don't look at BMI. I wanted to
ask about that.
Let's talk about it.
So I look at it because I've got to clinically and from an insurance perspective, and many adults value BMI because we prioritize thinness overall, and we conflate being slender with being quote unquote healthy. And I often say you could be skinny and cute and have a metabolic storm growing inside of you. And you could be in a bigger body and cute and have no metabolic storm growing inside of you.
That's right.
So I like the use of the word cute. I'm digging the word choice here, Maya. We'll unpack that in a second after we get over the enormous mountain of BMI. Yes, continue.
So I use it because we have to. I actually focus on cholesterol. I focus on inflammatory markers, even in kids. I focus on insulin, blood sugars. I focus on movement. And of course, there's a huge gamut in terms of where kids are in their ability to move based on whatever is happening in the family or their mental health or their actual ability. And then we do a lot of work with kids who have a variety of special healthcare needs. So then I take all of that into consideration. And the truth is that when we start to incorporate foods that feed cells alongside with whatever their desired foods are that also feed, they may not be quote unquote perfect, which is fine with me. We tend to see better outcomes. We see kids who have improved executive functioning. We see kids who are able to make it through a school day. We see kids who can tolerate having play dates. We see kids who enjoy ice skating and going out and doing all the things that we want kids to do. And that's where I like to focus rather than on the growth chart. I've also found too, especially when kids are going through puberty and they put on that actual weight and begin to lay down fat, adults freak out. And I'm like, hey, they must, because we want the linear growth and we want the menstruation and we want the lean body mass development. We want all of that stuff.
That's right. And I will just add that the FDA is with you on the it's not really a redefinition, the reprioritization of BMI. It is very clear that BMI was sort of the best measure we had for a while until it wasn't. Right. It is not the best measure. We can get into that in a second.
So Maya, you talked about a series of markers that you look at when you're looking at kids' nutrition and eating patterns. And those are markers that most adults would think of as things that get tracked for us, right? Like high cholesterol and insulin, concerns about diabetes and inflammation, right? We're all very familiar with inflammation in ourselves, but often we don't think about those markers as with respect to kids' health. And yet there are lots of trends in kids' health these days where those markers are actually really important. Can you talk about what we're seeing in terms of kids' disease and younger trends in terms of health concerns?
Absolutely. So in our practice, we're seeing kids show up with what used to be referred to as adult onset conditions, but they're coming in earlier and earlier. And in school, when I was in school to become a dietitian, we learned that there was kind of this like 10-year incubation period for what we refer to as a non-communicable disease, right? So something that you don't get from someone else, but that starts to brew inside of you. And so usually, we think of adults, especially in the 40s, as beginning to have these conditions, right? High cholesterol. We start to see people saying, like, oh my goodness, I'm now on a statin, or I'm taking high blood pressure medication, or I have type 2 diabetes, or my favorite is, oh, I have pre-diabetes and it runs in my family. And that happens so much around the 40s. The thing is that all of that was brewing well in the 20s. And no shame, no demonization on the kids' meal. But I have to bring that up because many of those conditions are actually linked to the types of foods that we eat. So foods that are rich in sources of added sugar, foods that are rich in sources of added salt, and foods that are rich in sources of saturated and synthetic fats. In this country and globally also, in general, those are the foods that are highly palatable. They're easier for us to enjoy. They tend to be shelf stable. They tend to be more accessible, meaning you could go anywhere in an urban center to the smallest place and find something that has high amounts of added sugars, fats, and salts as a hand-to-mouth snack. And in some places, those are the predominant options for meals. The other thing is that our kids' meals tend to be highly palatable and really rich in those foods, those nutrients that cause metabolic dysfunction. Now, I have to say this because I see it in my practice with the families that I work with and in the data that I read. More and more, we have two parents outside of the home, and it's a necessity to make ends meet for the average person living, for sure, in the United States. Because food prices are at an all-time high, because we have all sorts of shortages in things that are more fresh, we tend to lean on these packaged goods. It's also really hard to get dinner on the table and to get everyone to sit down to dinner at that same table. So what do? We make faster meals because it's more convenient. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for why it's become more convenient. The challenge is that many of those convenience foods don't actually serve our bodies, and we're introducing them younger and younger. It's funny because we then blame people, especially people who are poor, for making those choices when there are actually systems that are in place that force them to make those choices. In times of war, we do the best that we can, but we would never blame someone for eating whatever they have access to. But yet we do it in the US when we think about poverty. In New York City in particular, I heard a statistic that I was so shocked at, and I don't know the exact number, so I'm just going to use like a broad term, but there are more children now in elementary school that have cardiovascular disease markers than 20 years ago, which is shocking. That means that we've got kids in elementary school, so up until sixth grade, that have those adult cardiovascular disease markers. That means that, of course, you could have kids who are 15 and 16 with type 2 diabetes. And Kara, you can talk about the differentiation.
I want to jump in and just say that this is really important data, but we also are looking for it more.
Right.
So I want to say we know because common sense tells us that based upon all of the other evidence we have, it's a real phenomenon that this is increasing.
Yeah.
But that said, certainly when I was seeing patients in the office 20 years ago, pediatricians were being begged to start looking at these markers. And we didn't do it that often. It's really hard to convince a family to get a blood draw on a kid, young, healthy. Like, why would I do that? Also, insurance companies, and this becomes actually an extremely important deterrent. Insurance companies that see data that suggests as you get older, you will get sicker. Those insurance companies can penalize you, and
Right. They begin to deny
people,
care.
Right. And savvy people will decline lab tests for their kids because they're like, I don't want insurance to become unaffordable. So lots of things that confuse and muddy this data, but you are absolutely right, Maya, that the markers, and I should add one more thing. We have better markers now.
That's
have
true.
lab tests that are much more sensitive in terms of looking at future risk. But all of that said, it's just common sense that when we look at the food desert we have, the nutritionally dense, which is not a good thing, it's a bad thing, foods, those hand to mouth, as you described it. It's a perfect way of describing these foods. Grab them off of a shelf at a supermarket, at a pharmacy, wherever you are, at a gas station, and quick fuel in. We know that those foods are far more likely to cause heart disease than the foods that grow in the earth or that we can call whole foods and that we get in the wild.
Maya, you used a phrase when we first met that society is overfed and malnourished.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love for you to dig into that. You've talked about some of the causes, right? Again, this is not a judgment game. This is not a blame game, but we do know that there are all sorts of downstream impacts of that. Increased risk for disease. You talked about cardiovascular health. We've talked about advanced bone age in kids, diabetes, hypertension. What's the relationship there? Help us understand, as Cara said, these sort of calorie dense foods that are not actually nourishing people. Talk about like that sort of domino effect.
Yeah. I remember when I was doing my rotations and I was in the Bronx in New York City, close to Montefiore Hospital. And one of the things that we did as dietetic interns was you always create like a presentation in a community center, and then you have to talk to whoever's there about nutrition. And my preceptor at the time, brilliant preceptor, Sandra Arevalo, said, I want you to go for a walk in the neighborhood and, here's $20 from the center or $30, whatever. Get the food for your presentation. Vanessa, you would think, right? So here I am. I'm a dietetic intern. I'm in a predominantly Latina neighborhood. And I think, okay, I'm going to get some like plantain chips. Maybe I can find some fruits. Maybe I have all these ideas. And I go and I'm walking and I'm walking and I'm walking. I mean, I'm out for a good 30 minutes looking for a place where I can buy food, not a meal, but food and snack things to put a demo together.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up at kind of like a bodega, small type place, and didn't actually have anything that was actually lined up with anything that I wanted to say. Right? So I had things for the demo, but not things that could highlight or back up me saying phytonutrients found in plants, vitamin C found in X food, none of it. Fiber found, none of it. And so when I think about these areas that have what I refer to as food apartheid, because it's not unintentional, it is completely intentional. It's the removal of full service grocery stores that have variety, especially in impoverished areas. Then we end up with these foods that overfeed us nutrients that don't help our cells. And so I often say that food has this ability to up or down regulate how our body reacts. if we feed ourselves something that is a rich source of fiber, so let's say we have a plantain, which I love, and we have that plantain with some shrimp and cilantro and jalapeno and a little bit of tomato. That's a delicious bite.
I was like,
right?
I'll take some.
Me too right now. It's also a package that has a beautiful carbohydrate, but that is a great source of fiber and resistant starch. It also has protein coming from your shrimp, omega-3 fatty acids. Your cilantro has phytonutrients because it's an herb. Your jalapeno also is giving you vitamin C and other nutrients. You've got this package that's wonderful and nutrient dense. I rarely talk this way, but I will say for this conversation, in terms of its caloric or energy density, lower than if you have a fried potato and a piece of meat that is above 90% fat content with a piece of cheese product and a piece of bread that is mostly, I don't know, air, because that's what some of these breads are. We now have something in comparison. The second example has more energy density, so higher calories and fewer nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
It's also cheaper. It's also faster. It's more accessible. Like the option that my beautiful, plantain with shrimp and cilantro and jalapeno that I, suggested actually comes across as like kind of quote unquote bougie food.
I was going to say bougie.
Right? But there was a time when that was just, believe it or not, go to parts of the Caribbean and this is what folks are eating. Right? But it has changed. And so because we have access to these foods that don't serve our cells, we take in so much more energy than we need, but we're not getting enough nutrients. We're missing protein, fats, and carbs, vitamins, and minerals from sources that do not throw our blood sugars off.
Okay, I'm forcing the longevity lens in this conversation. We are getting there. Here we are. How do we help kids make in the moment decisions, given everything you've laid out? The intentional food deserts, the cost differentials, the quick energy of food that is less nutritionally beneficial for us, like all
the deliciousness, the way these products are created to make us want more and more of them.
Yes, the extra crunch, the extra everything, right? Okay, now, if we can barely resist it, how do we teach kids whose limbic systems are firing? They are emotional animals. They are really designed to make choices that feel good. How do we teach them how to feed themselves in a way that will keep their bodies healthier for longer, knowing that they are not wired to care about what happens longer? And smoking cessation campaigns that looked at prevention of cancer 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road didn't work with kids, right?
Right.
So how do we do it with nutrition?
So, all right, the answer that I'm going to give is the answer that I'm giving today. We need a culture shift. Because this is it takes a village. We need things like wellness in the schools. Full disclosure, I sit on the board, so that's one reason why I love wellness in the schools, but we need organizations like Wellness in the Schools. Food Corps is also one in public school settings. We need families to also take part in nutrition education. Everyone's going to jump when I say this. We got rid of home ec. Bring it back. Bring it back in a relevant way.
So in favor.
Right? Bring it back in a relevant way. We have kids that don't know how to make rice. We have kids that don't know how to make bread. And then add diet culture on top of that. People are like, rice is not good. Bread is not good. I'm like, friends, this is the most basic, affordable vehicle for getting other things into your body. So I'm like, bring back the home ec. The other thing is subsidize. We need the farm bill to subsidize the foods that we eat.
Mm-hmm.
If the foods that we eat are more affordable, then we will eat them. And we also have to not be afraid of flavor. There is more to life than salt and pepper.
I mean, I'm so fascinated by, I promise this comment will be relevant in a second, in 15 minutes. But like, I'm fascinated by, TikTok, there's so many terrible things about TikTok. But the sort of exposure to foods and exposure to other cultures' foods and exposure to cooking, and also what is with the hot sauce explosion in our culture? My children basically won't eat anything without hot sauce or tahini. It's like it has become so. It's like the youth are leading the adults in terms of some of this experimentation, and I do credit to some extent TikTok and sort of social media food trends, but barring all of these systemic changes I'm sorry to be Debbie Downer, but the chances of these things happening in the next 4 years are, fairly slim.
Yes. No pun intended.
I can't stop punning. It's like, I can't help myself. In our homes, in our families, in our sort of like co-parenting communal situations, as kids are becoming more and more independent, right? They're moving around on their own. They have allowance or money they've earned. They can go to 7-Eleven or wherever, the bodega, and get stuff. How do we convince them that it makes great sense for them to make choices, more, good nutrients, balanced diets, not all this crap in their bodies? How do we do that?
So I think a number of things. I think for sure the culture of food in the home is very important. Whoever the adults are in the home, model the behavior for the kids. I am a strong proponent of family meals. I think where and when possible, they should happen as much as possible. I also think that kids should be in the kitchen from a very young age. Like 3-year-olds, let them stand for as long as they can and tear parsley, right? Like there are things that kids can do. And I also, whenever I cook, whoever is around my table, and I'm not saying you need to do what I do, but if I'm in the kitchen and I'm cooking and something looks really fresh and crunchy, I will cut a piece of it and hand it to anyone that is sitting in front of me and be like, how does that taste? I think the idea that healthy food, the air quotes, they're just popping.
Puns. We're just going to call this episode puns and air quotes.
Literally. But like healthy food doesn't taste good it's just simply not true. Listen, we did a disservice to people by being like, the only way to be healthy is to have like brown rice and steamed kale and boiled chicken. Of course, everyone ran the other direction.
Right.
Right.
If we have a family table that is colorful and flavorful, we're more likely to want to return to it.
My kids, when they discovered white rice, were like, you have been lying to us all this time. And in my head, I was like, no white rice. And finally I was like, who gives a crap? Like, fine.
The fiber differential is like so different. It's like it's not what we all think. I think it's like maybe a gram or two. This is the thing that is extraordinary.
Right. And it's like, I'm subject to the marketing of like what's healthy and whatever. And I'm like, if they're going to eat shredded chicken with pico de gallo and sliced avocado and like a big green salad because I'm using white rice instead of brown rice, fine. Who cares?
Because everything in moderation. I mean, that's the other thing, right? We grew up in a deprivation culture. I mean, certainly I'm the oldest one on this podcast right now. And there's no question that like in the word bubble of the 1980s, deprivation would be big and bold. And it was all around this idea if you denied yourself, right? And then arrived the diet foods, right? In the late 80s, early 90s.
The snack wells.
Yes. And they were the cure to deprivation. But it turned out they were a disaster for health.
Full on disaster. Also, hello, Olestra later in the 90s.
Oh my God.
I mean, who wants that type of diarrhea?
Nobody.
Nobody.
I have a memory of driving back to college, stopping at a gas station on the way and getting, you guys are going to die, fat-free Twinkies.
Oh,
I mean, can you think
totally
of anything more disgusting? And I was like,
Vanessa,
I'm so virtuous. So, okay. So Maya, we're thinking about what we do at our table, right? And
yes,
we can, and
sure.
that's like, I want people to know we can only control what we control at our table. And as we let loose of the reins on so many different fronts with our kids as they gain independence, like we have to make peace with them making decisions, but we can still have impact because we can talk about how things like non-inflammatory foods can impact things like acne and how their belly feels during the school day and things like how their hair and nails look. So give us some language, Maya, about like how we talk to kids about those short-term decisions that might seem so yummy, but actually will have also short-term impacts on how they look and feel.
So this is where the parent has to do the same work that the provider does, where you have to come to terms with your own internal biases. You can't have the conversation until you've unpacked your own backpack. So if you are a child of diet culture, if you are a child of the 80s, if you are a child of TV dinners, you have to say, that was my experience and that was my experience, period. Your experience is yours, not your kids. What we really want to do is to do our best not to be judgmental in the conversation. I have found in working with families that when we allow kids to make choices and we talk to them about the breadth of choices and basically that things like great nails, skin, there's genetics, of course, but all the things that we do in the short term, it's what we do in the like over time that actually has that impact. So if you choose to have an empanada instead of like a tamale, and I choose empanada because it's fried and a tamale is steamed in many cases. And we know that there is some research around fried foods and people having a little bit of upset bellies, and it does have an impact on our skin, especially when we're going through hormonal shifts, children and adults. When if you choose to have that empanada, then how many empanadas do you want to have? That's one of the things that I talk to the families about, right? So like with the kids, it's, how much are you having and how often? And then it's those conversations, but without judgment. So if your kid is like, I'm having an empanada every day, you can say, is there something that you're having with it? Because when they're gone, they're going to do whatever they want.
There are a couple of other details that are helpful to point out, to call attention to, that have changed. Serving size has changed, right? So even though on the back of the package, what counts as a serving size may be consistent over time, when you look at the actual size of something that is sold in a store, a bagel, right? Go Google bagel in the 1980s versus bagel today size. I mean, the size is dramatically different. If we look
at 5 slices of bread,
it's unbelievable. Fork sizes, spoon sizes, the spoons that are sold that people buy and keep in their home provide a much higher volume every bite. But I think these are things that are important to call attention to because so much of what you're describing is so critical and how adults interpret it. Well, when I was younger, if I had the empanada, it was no big deal. Yeah, because the empanada was 3 times smaller, right? So,
but I think we also don't want, this is the other thing is I think we don't want kids to become fearful. So yes, serving sizes have grown. And I also think it's having those conversations in a factual way, but
That's
also
right.
inquisitive. So it's like, we want to say like, yeah, everything is larger. And so there are times and ways where that can be wonderful and fun. And then there are times and ways where like that's a celebration food. And then this is an everyday food.
Right. Or there's the economical argument. And I love this argument, which is the portion size is huge. Hey, if it's too big for you to eat on your own, share it with someone.
Totally.
Super easy, right? That's non-judgmental.
Also, how do you feel? Like, this is the
Right.
conversation I'm constantly having with my kids. I'm like, all right, let's see, what is the serving size for that? Oh, that looks kind of small. Let's eat it and see if we feel satiated or not. What happens if you just do what you feel like doing? How do you feel after that? Do you finish it? Do you feel like too full? Or,
Totally.
I mean, the joke in my house is always that Five Guys, like, they eat Five Guys and then immediately my whole family is like rushing upstairs to the bathroom. And I'm like, okay, that's really good information. Like,
there's information.
That's information.
Talk about data.
Talk about, right, a data set of 6. So I think, to your point, Maya, of getting curious is really important. If you could leave our listeners with one prompt to use as they head off to family dinner, what's a question or prompt you would offer up for them to use at the table?
Is there a fruit or vegetable that you enjoy that we can add to our next meal?
Done.
Easy
I'm
peasy.
writing it down.
Love it.
I'm writing it. It always comes from someone else's house, by the way. The exposure to new things always comes from someone else's table, someone else's celebration, someone else's
I'll have your
something.
kids over for dinner tonight, Vanessa.
So, Maya, I'm using that question at my table tonight. Thank you for unpacking an incredibly complicated topic in 45 minutes. We will link in the show notes to where folks can find your practice, your cookbook, and thank you for helping us frame this conversation in a new and really important way. I feel like we've gotten over the hump of our fear of having this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having it. And it's not an easy one, and it's as hard as talking about religion because it's something that we each do daily, and it is also so intertwined with our identities and then also our lived experiences. So it is, of course, a major, it's very touchy. So I am honored to have the conversation with you both.
Thanks, Maya.
Thanks, Maya.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.